Welcome to i-TUTOR Economics NCERT series. In the last class, we completed chapter 2 up to the concept of national income. Today, we are going to begin chapter 3, theory of employment and income. So, if we look at economic history, many countries have faced serious economic problems from time to time. Among all these problems, unemployment has always been one of the most serious and challenging issues. To understand this problem, economists have tried to explain the relationship between employment and income. That is, how the level of employment in an economy affects the level of income and vice versa. The classical economists and Keynes gave two very different explanations of this relationship. Do you know what are they? The classical economists had great faith in a theory called law of markets. It's given by the French economist J.B. Say. So this law is also known as Say's law. So it is also known as Say's law. Later, J.M. Keynes, one of the most influential economists of the mid-20th century, he challenged this classical view and presented his own theory, which completely changed modern economics. So in this chapter, we will study both the classical theory and Keynes theory to understand how they explain employment and income determination. So before we study the theories of employment, we should first understand what full employment actually means. What does that mean? Full employment refers to a situation where every person who is able and willing to work at the prevailing wage rate gets job. Full employment refers to a situation in which every able-bodied person who is willing to work at the prevailing wage rate is employed. In simple words, it means that there is no involuntary unemployment in the economy. If someone doesn't have a job, it's only because they don't want to work, not because there are no jobs available. So Keynes' definition is that full employment is a situation where there is an absence of involuntary unemployment. Okay. This means everyone who wants to work and can work at the existing wage rate has employment. And what is learner's definition? He told that full employment is that level of employment at which any further increase in spending would cause inflation. That means wages and prices start rising. So according to Lerner, once an economy reaches full employment, trying to create even more jobs only leads to inflation and not more employment. So suppose in a country there are 100 people who are willing and able to work. Out of that, 98 of them have jobs and the remaining 2 don't want to work at the current wage rate. The economy is considered to have full employment because those who want to work already have jobs. So full employment does not mean zero unemployment. Some level of frictional or voluntary unemployment will always exist. People changing jobs, fresh graduates searching for works, and so on. So every economy in the world aims to achieve a level called full employment equilibrium. That means a stage where all the available resources, that means land, labor, capital, they are fully and efficiently used to produce the maximum possible output. But in practical terms, when we talk about full employment, we mainly refers to the full employment of the labor force. That is, people who are willing and able to work should get employment opportunities. Now, let's move to the next topic, unemployment and its types. So, unemployment simply means a situation where people are willing to work and able to work but cannot find suitable jobs. People are able and willing to work but they are not able to find suitable jobs. So when we talk about unemployment in India, it's important to remember that the nature of unemployment is quite different in rural and urban areas. It's different in rural as well as in urban areas. In rural areas, we usually see 2 main types of unemployment. What are they? Disguised unemployment and also seasonal unemployment. Disguised unemployment and seasonal unemployment. Disguised unemployment, where more people are engaged in work than actually needed. For example, on farms. And what about seasonal unemployment? It's an unemployment where people are jobless during off seasons in agriculture. Okay, so we can see discussed unemployment and seasonal unemployment mainly in rural areas. On the other hand, in urban areas, we find types like frictional unemployment, then structural unemployment and open unemployment. Frictional unemployment means temporary unemployment when people change jobs. Structural, it's a mismatch between skills and availability of jobs, and open unemployment refers to people actively seeking jobs but unable to find any. So also due to rapid urbanization, many people migrate from rural to urban areas in search of jobs. This increases the labor force in cities and adds to the already existing unemployment problem. Okay. Now, let's look at the types of unemployment. In developing countries like India, the nature of unemployment is quite different from that of developed countries. Okay, in developed countries, unemployment is usually temporary. It may be cyclical or frictional, but in developing countries, it is mostly structural unemployment, which happens mainly due to slow rate of capital formation. So, the major types of unemployment are cyclical unemployment, seasonal unemployment, frictional unemployment, educated unemployment, technical unemployment, structural unemployment, and also discussed unemployment. So, we will explain each of these types in detail one by one. First one, cyclical unemployment. What does that mean? So, this type of unemployment happens when the economy slows down during recession or depression. In simple words, when people buy less, businesses produce less, and as a result, many lose their jobs. It happens because of low demand in the economy, also called deficiency of effective demand. And the best solution is when the government spends more on public projects or the RBI uses expansionary monetary policy to boost demand and production. We will study about expansionary monetary policy and other RBI's policies in detail in the coming chapters. Okay, so cyclical unemployment exists during the phase of economic slowdown or during recession or depression. Hope you understand. Now, what about seasonal unemployment? This type of unemployment happens only during certain seasons of the year. That's why it's called seasonal unemployment. For example, in agriculture, people work during sowing and harvesting seasons but remain jobless in the off seasons. And the same happens in agro-based industries like sugar or tourism sector, like ice cream factories and holiday resorts, which work only during specific times of the year. Now, frictional unemployment or temporary unemployment. And this type is temporary in nature and happens when people are in between jobs. It may also occur due to lack of skills, machines breaking down, or shortage of raw materials. For example, when someone leaves from one job in search of other, the short period is called frictional unemployment. That time between leaving that one job and searching for the other, or joining the other, and that time period is called temporary unemployment. What about educated unemployment? This is when educated people can't find suitable jobs for their qualification. It's very common in India because of our faulty education system, then a lack of practical or employable skills, too many graduates, and everyone wanting white collar job means office jobs instead of manual work. So even highly educated people may remain unemployed or underemployed. Now, technical unemployment. What does that mean? And this type of unemployment happens because of technological advancement. When new machines or modern techniques are introduced, they need fewer works. Since machines can do the same work faster and cheaper, they can do only fewer works. For example, when industries move from manual to automation, what happens? Some workers lose their job. So labor saving devices and capital intensive production cause technical or technological unemployment. Structural unemployment. What does that structural unemployment means? This occurs due to major changes in the structure of the economy or society. When demand for certain goods falls, and people shift to new products, the workers in old industries lost their job. So for example, when people started using mobile phones, what happened? The demand for cameras, tape recorders and film rolls went down, causing unemployment in those sectors. So structural unemployment results from deep long-term changes in the economic structure and not just temporary problems. Now, what is meant by decreased unemployment? This is very common in rural areas, right? We have already told that. And what does this decreased unemployment means? This is, as I have already told you, this is very common in agriculture in India. It happens when more people are employed than actually needed for particular work. Even if a few workers stop working, the total production remains the same, meaning their contribution to output is zero or negligible. I'll tell you an example. On a small farm, maybe only 4 people are needed to work efficiently, but 7 people are working. That means the extra 3, 7 minus 4, that is the extra 3 are discretely unemployed. That means even without them, the same efficiency of output will be given. Okay, so in such cases, the marginal productivity of labor is 0 or even negative. Marginal productivity means 7 minus 4, that means 3. Okay, so it is 0 or negative. Now, we are going to study about classical theory of employment. There wasn't just one single theory called classical theory of employment. Instead, it is a combination of ideas and views given by several classical economists about how income and employment are determined in an economy. It all began with Adam Smith. Who is Adam Smith? He is known as the father of economics. Okay, so it all began with Adam Smith, who wrote the famous book An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of Wealth of Nations in 1776. After him, economists like David Ricardo, J.S. Mill, J.B. Say and A.C.P. Gu developed these ideas further. And main assumptions, economics is all about assumptions, right? So the main assumptions of classical economics or classical theory of employment are: the classical economists believe that economy always operate at a level of full employment in the long run. We have already told about the definition of full employment. Okay, so this classical economists believe that economy always operate at a level of full employment in the long run, not in short run. Long run means for a long period of time, means year after 1 year. And the next assumption is that unemployment is only temporary and will automatically get corrected by the market force. Then wages and prices are flexible, meaning if there is unemployment, wages will fall and firms will hire more people again. And what is the next assumption? The economy works under a competitive market system, and it is also called laissez-faire economy, where there is no government interference in the business activities. So according to them, full employment is a natural state of the economy, and if any unemployment occurs, it is only temporary. Okay, so this is what classical theory of employment says. Now, Say's law of market. Now let's look at the core idea of the classical theory of employment, which is Say's law of market. This law was given by J.B. Say. He was a French economist and industrialist. He was greatly influenced by Adam Smith and David Ricardo. Adam Smith is also known as father of economics. Okay, so Say gave a very famous statement, that is, supply creates its own demand. This means that wherever or whatever is produced in the economy will automatically create enough income to buy that output. So there cannot be a situation of general overproduction or unemployment. Okay, Say said that when firms produce goods, they make payments to the factors of production. When firms produce goods, what will they do? They make payments to the factors of production. What are the factors of production in economics? Land, labor, capital and organization. Okay, so Say said when firms produce goods, they make payment to the factors of production like wages to the labor, rent to land, interest to capital and profit to the entrepreneurs. So these payments become income for the households. and then households spend this income to buy goods and services produced by firms. So according to say, every production creates an equivalent amount of demand, because whatever income people earn, they use to buy goods. In simple words, we can say that a person earns income by producing something, and that income is spent to buy what others produce. Hence, say concluded that there is no chance of general unemployment or overproduction in the economy, because supply will automatically create its own demand. So Say's law of market says that supply creates its own demand. Hope you understand. Now let's move on to Keynes' theory of employment and income. In 1936, John Maynard Keynes, or J.M. Keynes, published his famous book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. And this work was a major turning point in economics, as it challenged the classical view that the economy automatically adjusts to full employment. Keynes criticized the classical economists who believed that market forces always bring the economy to equilibrium. He argued that this is not always true, and unemployment can persist even in a market economy. So what are the key features of Keynes' theory? So first one, it is a general theory. Okay, Keynes' theory is also called general theory because it explains all situations, not just full employment but also underemployment and unemployment. Then it focused on short run. Unlike classical economists who focused on the long run, Keynes emphasized the short run. He assumed that factors like capital goods, supply of labor, technology and efficiency of labor remains fixed in the short run while determining the level of employment. Then third one, there is a possibility of underemployment. That means Keynes showed that even if resources are available, the economy may not employ them fully, leading to underemployment equilibrium. So classical economists said, don't worry, the economy will fix itself. Keynes said, no, the economy may not always fix itself. People may remain unemployed and government intervention may be needed to create jobs. So that's about Say's law of market and Keynes' theory of employment and income. Now do you know about effective demand? According to Keynes, effective demand determines the level of employment in the economy. When effective demand rises or increases, firms produce more, so employment also rises. When effective demand decreases, what happens? Production falls and employment will also decline. Therefore, employment in an economy is not automatic but depends on the total demand for goods and services. What are the determinants of effective demand? Keynes said that effective demand is determined by two main factors: consumption expenditure, investment expenditure. Okay. Consumption expenditure means the total spending by households on goods and services, and this depends on income and marginal propensity to consume, MPC. Okay, MPC means it's a fraction of extra income that people spend on consumption. So according to Keynes, when income rises, consumption rises too, but less than the rise of income. What about investment expenditure? That is spending by firms on capital goods like machines, buildings and so on. So effective demand mainly means consumption plus investment. In a broader sense, aggregate demand is the total demand in the economy and it has four components. What are they? Consumption demand, investment demand, government expenditure and also net exports. Consumption demand means spending by households. Investment demand, spending by firms. Government expenditure or G is the spending by the government on goods and services, and net export means export minus import. So aggregate demand is equal to, we have already studied it in yesterday's class. Okay, aggregate demand is equal to C plus I plus G plus net export or X minus M. So the level of employment depends on how much total demand exists in the economy. If demand is low, people remain unemployed even if there are resources available. Aggregate supply function. Now let's move to aggregate supply function, which is an important concept of Keynes' theory. Aggregate supply refers to the total value of goods and services produced in an economy in a year. In other words, it is the national product or national income. The aggregate supply function shows that as the level of employment increases, the total output of goods and services also increase. I will explain you. To produce goods, employers hire laborers, right? And also purchase inputs and raw materials. Then production cost involves wages, rent, raw materials and so on. If the revenue from selling good is greater than the cost of production, the entrepreneur will be motivated to employ more laborers, purchase more inputs, then produce more outputs and so on. So higher employment leads to higher production and it will lead to higher aggregate supply. The aggregate supply function is an upward sloping curve. Okay, it's an upward sloping curve. More employment leads to more output, and entrepreneurs decide how much to produce based on the profitability at each level of employment and output. And this aggregate supply price, okay, it is the total amount of money that all entrepreneurs in the economy expect to receive from selling the goods and service produced by a given number of workers. Here, this price doesn't mean the price of a single product, okay. It refers to total sales revenue or sales proceeds from the output produced. So, for different levels of employment, there will be different aggregate supply prices. Okay. Now, what are the components of aggregate supply price? First one is aggregate consumption expenditure. Then aggregate private savings, net tax payment and also personal transfer payments. Aggregate or desired consumption expenditure means total spending by households on goods and service, that's all. Then aggregate private savings, it refers to total savings households intend to keep aside from their income. Net tax payments, that is taxes to be received by the government minus any transfer payments. Transfer payments means one-way transactions. Okay, so taxes to be received by the government minus any transfer payments, subsidies or interest payment the government has to make. Personal transfer payment means payments to foreigners. Okay, that we are representing it by RF. For example, donations or aid sent to abroad. Therefore, aggregate supply is equal to C plus S plus T plus RF. C plus S plus T minus RF. C means aggregate consumption expenditure, S aggregate private savings, T net tax payments and RF personal transfer payments. Okay. In other words, aggregate supply price represents the total income generated in the economy. That means the total money expected from production and its sale. Aggregate supply curve and equilibrium. So in Keynes' theory of employment, we often consider a simple two-sector economy consisting of households and business firms. Households who decides on consumption expenditure, business firms who decides on investment expenditure. What are the key assumptions? For simplicity, we can make some key assumptions. First one is that the consumption function is linear, meaning households spend a constant fraction of their income. And planned investment by firms is autonomous. Second assumption is that planned investment by firms is autonomous. It does not depend on the current level of income. Okay. And what's the equilibrium between aggregate demand and aggregate supply? Aggregate demand function or ADF. It represents total planned spending in the economy. That means consumption plus investment. Aggregate supply function. It represents total output that firms are willing to produce at different levels of employment. And equilibrium occurs at the point where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply or ADF is equal to ASF. And at this point, planned expenditure equals to actual output. And the level of employment and output is determined. If demand exceeds supply or demand is greater than supply, what happens? Firms produce more and hire more workers. And if supply exceeds demand, that means supply is greater than demand, what happens? Production slows down and employment may fall. So think of it like a market of goods. If households demand goods, firms supply goods. When demand is equal to supply, the economy is in equilibrium and the level of employment is stable. In Keynes theory or in Keynesian theory, there are two approaches to determine equilibrium level of income and employment. What are those approaches? Aggregate demand, aggregate supply approach, and also saving investment approach. In this chapter, we focus on the ADAS approach to understand how equilibrium income and employment are determined. So equilibrium via or through aggregate demand, aggregate supply approach. We can look at that. Aggregate demand means, or it represents, total planned spending by households and firms. Aggregate supply represents total output that firms are willing to produce at each level of employment. Equilibrium will occur at a point where AD is equal to AS, or aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. And this figure, look at this figure. This happens at the point E. This point, okay, point E, where the employment level is ONO. Okay, look at this graph. I will explain you this. X-axis shows the level of employment. That means the number of workers employed, level of employment. Then Y-axis shows aggregate supply, price or revenue. That means total money firms expect to receive from production. And look at this curve, AS curve. This is called, this curve, AS curve. This is called aggregate supply curve. It is upward sloping, showing that as employment increases, total output and expected revenue also increases, and firms hire more workers when profits are possible. And aggregate demand curve, this red line is called aggregate demand curve. So it is a downward sloping relative to employment. It shows that planned spending at each levels of employment. When aggregate demand is less than aggregate supply, firms cannot sell all output and profits will fall. And this point E, it is called equilibrium point, where AD is equal to AS. This is the point, this E is the point where AD curve and AS curve intersect. And point D is where AD equal to ES, and it is the equilibrium point, and employment at this point is ON. This point is ON, this point, okay, ONO. And aggregate supply at ONO is NI minus RI. But firms can actually produce M1 minus N1. Okay, so expected profit is M1 minus R1. This one is the expected profit here. So entrepreneurs will hire more workers until point E, because hiring more increases production and profit. And beyond ONO employment, the AD curve lies below AS. Why? Because firms cannot sell all outputs at the expected price. This will lead to losses, so they stop hiring more workers. So what is the concept of this effective demand? Effective demand is always equal to the level of demand at which firms plan to employ labor and produce output, and it determines the equilibrium employment and output level in the economy. Firms hire workers as long as selling more goods give them profit. When all demand, or when the demand matches what firms can sell at profitable price, employment stops, and that's equilibrium employment. Okay. So after understanding the theory of employment and income, the next important concept we study is the Keynesian multiplier. Okay, Keynesian multiplier. And this multiplier shows how a change in investment or spending affects the total income and output in the economy. Or in simple words, we can say that it's a small change in investment or spending that can lead, or if there is a small change in investment or spending, that can lead to a much larger change in a total income and employment. So this concept is very important because it explains why government spending can boost employment and why demand matters in determining income levels of Keynesian framework. So this table shows a comparison between classical theory and Keynesian theory. So in Keynesian theory, there is short run equilibrium, classical long run equilibrium. And saving is a why? Saving is a social virtue. Then the function of money is a medium of exchange on the one side and the store of value on other. And in classical theory, we are seeing the function of money as an act as a medium of exchange. Then macro approach to national approach and micro foundation to macro problems. In Keynesian theory, state intervention is advocated. Here, laissez-faire policy is advocated. And applicable to all situations, full employment and less than full employment. Classical theory is applicable to only full employment situation. Then capitalism has inherent contradictions. Capitalism is well good. Budgeting should be adjusted to requirement of economy and balanced budget. So these are all about the difference between classicism and Keynesian theories. Remember this also, rate of interest is determined by the demand for and supply of money in classical theory, and rate of interest is determined by savings and investment in this Keynesian theory. Then rate of interest is a flow in classical theory and rate of interest is a stock in Keynesian theory. We have already studied the difference between flow and stock in the last class. Now let's go to the summary part of this chapter. We have studied about classical theory and Keynesian theory. What was classical theory? They believed in full employment automatically due to market forces. Then wages and prices are flexible and economy is self-correcting. And we also studied about Say's law, that he said that supply creates its own demand and there is no possibility of general unemployment in the long run. Then we have studied about Keynesian theory. They challenged the classical view, that is, economy may not always reach full employment. They introduced the concept of effective demand, which determines employment and output. Then they focused on short run, assuming capital, technology and efficiency are fixed. Then they emphasize the role of government spending in increasing employment through the multiplier effect. We also studied about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So equilibrium employment and output are determined when aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. Entrepreneurs hire more workers until expected profits are maximized, which happens at effective demand. And beyond this point, hiring more leads to losses, so employment stops. Therefore, Keynes' work challenged classical ideas and showed that state intervention in the economy can stabilize output and employment. And this led to a shift in economic theory and government policies worldwide, especially after World War II period. Okay, so that's all about this chapter. Hope you understand. For more related contents, do like, share and subscribe.